news, there finally is an end in sight after a record-breaking season.
Yeah, 30 named storms this season. So what were some of the biggest storms you saw this year?
You know, this season has been off the charts in so many different ways. I'm 23 years old, my hairline is receding, and I think this season has part of that.
Don't
like you said,
say that.
30 named storms, 13 hurricanes, 6 major, and what we saw this season were multiple double whammies. For example, Lake Charles, Louisiana saw Hurricane Laura, Category 4, with winds over 220.
Trip, certainly. Tell me more about what's coming the way of the Gulf Coast with these other storms that I was mentioning.
Yeah, we've reached the peak of hurricane season, and unfortunately, there's no rest for the weary. We have multiple other storms we're tracking, including a threat in the Gulf of Mexico. But first, we start with Teddy, Category 3 over the open Atlantic. That will impact Bermuda, with winds gusting as high as 200 kilometers per hour. And it's actually developing into a tropical cyclone. And already, we're seeing, based on scatterometer data from satellites, a closed circulation, which means that's a precursor to a tropical storm. And if it does become named, it will see the name Wilfred.
So can you tell us what these fire tornadoes look like and where exactly they touch down?
Yeah, so there were 5 fire tornadoes in just 2 hours between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on Saturday. And you have to keep in mind, these are not little fire whirls like you sometimes see in the flames on even a stove or a campfire. These were actual tornadoes made out of fire. And what happened, you had all the smoke go up, an incredible amount of buoyancy thanks to the heat released by the fire. And that took on the characteristics of a supercell thunderstorm, the entire smoke plume starting to rotate. And you had at least 5 tornadoes of fire and smoke drop down, with winds likely between 160 and 200 kilometers per hour.
You know, these images, when we're looking at them, they are...
Is it very difficult when you've got disruption to the jet stream to provide that service?
It is. You know, actually, we had looked back in January to see whether or not there were any signals that we would get this massive cold air outbreak. And even towards the end of January, we really weren't seeing it until about 7 to 10 days before. And that's roughly the range at which we can say, hey, something big is coming up the pipeline. Yeah, that's really a big thing here. It's not the temperatures that bad to begin with. It's more the fact that their infrastructure can't really handle this. It's like how the same temperatures that Phoenix sees every summer are routine there, but would translate to tens of thousands of deaths in New York City because the infrastructure there can't handle it. It's about local anomalies. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is the combination of very heavy snow and ice that's led to car accidents, fuels not being able to be transported to area power plants, and an increased demand on the power grid, all thanks to the extremely cold temperatures they've seen.
And what is remarkable meters per hour. For more, I'm joined by Matthew Cappucci. He's a meteorologist at the Washington Post. Matthew, good to see you. He's joining me from Lake Charles, Louisiana. How's it looking where you are?
You know, Jennifer, people are really gearing up for what could be a pretty bad storm here. I sat in traffic for about 5 hours yesterday trying to come into Lake Charles because there was a 60-kilometer backup of people trying to just get out. They had that experience with Laura. They know what a hurricane can do, and now everybody's trying to flee. I've heard from people who spent 7 hours trying to go from here to Houston, just trying to get out of Dodge. But I want to take you outside real quick if I can and show you some of the damage that we've seen just from Laura. Take a look at this. This once was an auto body and parts store, and now look, the entire thing destroyed, dismantled, disheveled, the front walls pushed in, and the entire building just having collapsed. And this is going into another hurricane. So we already saw significant damage with Laura about a month and a half ago. And unfortunately, all this debris you see is going to be blowing around tonight.
That is so distressing. And when we look at the trajectory of this storm, Matthew, and the size of it, but Laura's got the better right hook. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, it looks like that right now. The biggest issue at this point, we just don't really know whether or not it will remain intact after hitting Cuba. It's scraping along the southern coast of Cuba right now. And if that central vortex remains in good structure, it will likely move over the Gulf and rapidly intensify into perhaps a Category 2 or even Category 3 plus storm. All weather systems to the north, and that's bad news. In addition, high pressure actually expands the atmosphere vertically, allowing these fires to get taller before they kind of cap out at what we call the tropopause, that layer they can't go above. And so you have amazing, incredibly tall wildfires with smoke plumes to 16,500 meters.
Temperatures.
Yeah, this is the coldest era in a generation. We've seen temperatures colder than we've seen since 1989. Minus 14 in Oklahoma City, 2 degrees in Dallas-Fort Worth, and down to only 12 in Houston. And that in an area that doesn't really see temperatures like this. Really bad news. And all this can be traced back to a disruption in the polar vortex that started at the beginning of January. Now think about your morning cup of coffee. If you stir it, you get kind of a whirlpool and a dip in there, and that's kind of how the polar vortex behaves. But if you interrupt that vortex, if you were to put your hand in the cup of coffee, all of a sudden the vortex would fill in, it would weaken, and that's exactly what happened when a weather system disrupted the polar vortex. That pushed all the cold air contained down to mid-latitudes, and now we're getting these blobs, these lobes of frigid Arctic air all the way down over the lower 48. 15 years worth of data this late in the season.
I was going to ask you, how would you describe this season?
This season has been the season full of surprises. You know, ordinarily we see hurricanes start to weaken as they move ashore, but instead...
So what is the situation on the ground?
You know, it's like a big old tornado went through. I'm seeing pretty significant damage behind me right now. I'm on the side of Interstate 10, a major thoroughfare, and on the westbound side, all but one lane is blocked by trees. Here you see a couple trees toppled, blocking the breakdown lane, but earlier on, I was driving in from the east, and it was virtually impassable at some places. I saw significant damage to a steel truss building that was leveled, a big industrial building of some sort. I saw numerous mobile homes either flipped, destroyed, de-roofed over in the town of Sulphur. Numerous restaurants damaged heavily as well, some with shattered windows, projectiles having moved through into the building, and multiple tractor trailers, semi-trucks, flipped, toppled, even pushed off the highway. On the side of the highway right now, you can actually see a lot of water down in the culvert. This area saw upwards of 20 centimeters worth of rainfall. And where I was, about 6 or 7 kilometers off to the west, we saw wind gusts to 200 kilometers per hour nearby.
One of the big concerns with this storm was
Things were so bad.
So believe it or not, this actually started back in early January with a disruption to the polar to weaken, and as a result, it'll hold in those winds for longer. At the same time, too, it's tapping into some energy from the jet stream, which means even though it's moving away from the warm ocean waters that sustain it, it now has this energy at the mid-levels of the atmosphere that it can drag down as momentum to get those wind gusts towards the ground.
So looking ahead, are there any other storms that are on the horizon we need to start paying attention to?
Right now, thankfully, we have a period of quiescence thanks to something called a convectively coupled Kelvin wave. Sounds kind of scary. Basically, it's this big overturning circulation in the upper atmosphere. And right now, we're over the subsiding branch of that, which suppresses air, pushes it down. So the Atlantic looks to remain quiet for about 2 weeks' time, but it looks like towards the end of August into early September, as we get under the rising branch of that, we'll see more hurricane activity around the same time as the climatological peak of hurricane season. In addition, we have a La Nina, very warm ocean temperature, so it looks like September will be a very busy month.
Wow. All right, Matthew, appreciate
that satellite imagery really tells you something, but we're going to get the full story now from Matthew Cappucci. He's a meteorologist with the Washington Post. He is live in Gulf Shores, Alabama. Matthew, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. What is the situation where you are right now?
Nick, thanks so much for having me. We're seeing widespread wind damage here on Gulf Shores, not even near the immediate coastline. I'm about 2 kilometers inland right now, and yet you see significant structural damage here. We had gusts overnight to 140 to 150 kilometers per hour, as well as widespread rainfall. Now, I was driving down earlier on, about probably a quarter of all the trees, and these are big trees, half a meter thick, are toppled. Some of them snapped by the force of the wind, and others just pushed over because all the rainfall we had, up to 50 centimeters, made it easy for those roots to come right out of the soil.
Okay, 2 things. One, thanks for converting to metric system. We do appreciate that. But secondly, what does that tell you about
that you're safe, and what's the latest where you are?
Well, my goodness, it was a crazy night. We saw winds gusting up to 111 miles per hour. So in other words, more than 160 kilometers per hour. Near me, that a gust of 200.
Kind of thing. I mean, you know it's coming, but you're never quite sure what you're going to get until it hits.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me was when yesterday I fueled up at a gas station, and it seemed like a pretty well-built, sturdy building. And this morning, I drove about 10 kilometers west to go to the same gas station again, and the entire thing was in shambles. There was a projectiles when Delta came through. Now, earlier on, we actually saw the mayor of downtown Lake Charles call out the head of FEMA, saying they're just not getting the help they need. And I can understand why. It seems like that area has been somewhat forgotten because it's kind of...
is in Slidell, Louisiana tonight. Matthew, thanks for joining us. Where is the storm? How fast moving is it at this point?
Now, right now, the good news is picked up its pace just a little bit, but earlier when it made landfall, it was moving at only 3.5 kilometers per hour. That's hardly walking pace, and that's part of the reason why we saw so much in the way of flooding. Now, it's moving about 10 to 15 kilometers per hour as it moves into northeastern Alabama. Next up, Georgia, the Southeast, and eventually the Carolinas. And they'll see less rainfall, between about 10 and 15 centimeters, but still a serious flood threat for those in line.
So, Matthew, which areas did get the most rain? How much did they get?
Storm surge several meters as well, but that chemical fire ongoing right now. We have one of the largest oil refineries in the world in this area, or at least in the United States. So many power.
Let's get more on this now from Matthew Cappucci, an atmospheric scientist. Matthew, thank you very much for your time. Outside the Rugby World Cup, possibly the Grand Prix, what impacts are you expecting from this?
Well, Hagibis is an extremely impressive storm. It's been
Why is this all happening, and why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, so it really is a big deal. You mentioned 6 to 11 degrees above normal. The temperatures in many of the Great Lakes, about what you'd see this time of year off the outer banks of the Carolinas or down off coastal Virginia. So very toasty stuff.
Of course, in the midst of a pandemic, how difficult do you see that recovery phase once we have crossed this the storm?
That's a very tricky element of it, because with storm shelters, you have a lot of people all in one communal area. And now there's so many hoops we have to jump through in order to get that. In fact, the American Meteorological Society recently put out a statement saying if you do go to a storm shelter, you're responsible for your own masks, sanitizers, and they're working with state and local officials to make sure you can maintain social distancing while in the shelter. So it's difficult going in, and it will be kind of interesting to see how people evolve after the fact in terms of the cleanup process in the wake of a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, thank you. That's Matthew Cappucci, meteorologist from the Washington Post. You know, things are getting serious if the Americans are running out of names for their storms.
Okay, hopefully it's not too busy for you, Matthew. We want your hairline to stay in place. Matthew Cappucci, meteorologist for the Washington Post. Thank you so much.
Thank you.